Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro here. So we're going to take a look at chapter 12. A lot of the beginning of chapter 12 focuses on the reasons why the War of 1812 happens. And then also one of the big things that happens in chapter 12 is a lot of the effects of the War of 1812 on the nation. So let's take a look at the War of 1812. One of the things that we were talking about in class are the major causes, right? So the major causes of the War of 1812 was the continued impressment by the British and also their instigation of the natives. So in 1812, when all of the new Western states were included into the Union, and we get all these new Democratic Republicans as congressmen, they're going to begin clamoring for war. They're going to be demanding war because of the attack on the frontier. And again, because the Democratic Republicans have a history of being anti-British. And so they are going to demand a war with the British. One of the leading people in terms of demanding this war by these so-called war hawks is going to be Henry Clay. So Henry Clay of Kentucky is going to ask, and he... young congressman from Kentucky. He's going to play a very important role in the shaping of our country in the years to come. One of the really important things, too, is that the Democratic Republicans had it in their minds that they were going to invade Canada. They were hoping, right, that by invading Canada, they would gain all this territory, finally kick the British out of North America. And if they gained all this territory in Canada would turn into farmland. And that would actually mean that they would eventually become states, and that those states would be agricultural states, and they would enter the House of Representatives and Senate, right, as Democratic Republicans. So one of the things, right, is the regular army was actually ill-trained, ill-disciplined, widely scattered, right? So we are not prepared at all to go to war. The militia was even worse. The generals were semi-senile, right? A lot of them were still Revolutionary War generals. So again, Canada became a target because British forces were the weakest there. American forces should have taken Montreal, but we didn't. We actually went through the Great Lakes. So on land, Americans were overwhelmed. The American Navy was much better than the British when it comes to the War of 1812. One of the ships that is still the longest active ship, but obviously it's not going to be used for war, but it's still a commissioned ship. It's actually stationed in Boston, is the United States Constitution. It was also nicknamed Old Ironsides. The admiral of the ship was a guy by the name of Oliver Perry. And at the Battle of the Thames, he were able to defeat the British and actually help us escape out of Canada. The British began to pour into Canada. One of the things that ends up happening after we attempt to take Canada is the British are going to try to defeat us. And so the British are going to try to hit us first at New York. And so they decide to invade New York and try to, again, kind of cut us off the way that they tried to do during the Revolutionary War. A guy by the name of Admiral Thomas MacDonough is able to defeat the British at the Battle of New York. So the British Army was forced to retreat, saving New York, and so New England stayed safe in terms of the War of 1812. This actually saved a possible dissolution of the Union because it would have cut off New England from the rest of the country. So the British decided then that since they were unsuccessful in New York, that they were going to try to attack us in the Chesapeake. And so what they did is they launched an attack of the Chesapeake in August of 1814. And so there was a group called the Blandesbergs. And so this group of Americans, they were supposed to protect the Chesapeake. And when they saw all of the British arrive, they turned around and ran. And so it's known as the Blandesberg races. The British marched into Washington, D.C., and they destroyed Washington, D.C. They pretty much burned the entire thing down. Dolly Madison, James Madison, they all had to jam, right? They had to pick up the government and go. So they went north. About 45 miles north of Washington, D.C. is the city of Baltimore, right? So again, founded after Lord Baltimore. And there is a fort there that protects the city of Baltimore. It's called Fort William McHenry. And so there was after the British burned down D.C., they marched up to Fort William McHenry. And so there was a long struggle there. At the end, the next day, the Americans had emerged as victorious at the Battle of Fort William McHenry, the Battle for Baltimore. And this is where, of course, Francis Scott Key writes the famous Star Spangled Banner, which eventually becomes the national anthem. And we'll talk a little bit about that in class. So the British made attempts to take New Orleans and crush the Mississippi. So again, they failed attempt at New York, a failed attempt in Washington. they decide that they are going to try to attack the Americans where they think they are the weakest, and that is along the Mississippi. And so they launch an attack on New Orleans. And the guy who is leading the Americans at New Orleans is none other than Andrew Jackson, who was partly responsible for defeating the Mississippi Confederacy 3 years earlier. The British were overconfident again, launched a frontal attack on a hillside, and the Andrew Jackson and the Americans were able to, whoop on the British. It's actually the bloodiest defeat for the British during the War of 1812. The irony is that the taken place. Andrew Jackson became a hero. He is seen as the defender of New Orleans. They call him Old Hickory because the hickory wood is very strong. The irony, like I said, is that the battle should have never happened because the treaty to end the war actually was signed 2 weeks earlier. So the Battle of New Orleans should have never happened. Had they had Twitter, had they had the technology that they have today, anything faster than what they had back then, right? They would have known that a treaty was signed in Ghent, Belgium, 2 weeks earlier. Now, here's the thing. The Americans go into the war super fired up, excited. We're going to defeat the British. And what ends up happening is they realize, oh, crap, we probably cannot defeat the British. And so it soon turns into, oh, crap, well, let's at least tie so we don't lose this war. So the Americans, when the Treaty of Ghent is signed, they're very excited that we at least tied the British, because that's really the result of the War of 1812, is that it's a tie. Nothing gained, nothing lost. But when the news came out about what happened on New Orleans, Americans were super excited. And the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812, it resulted in an incredible wave of nationalism for the United States. So people were partying. They were super excited, right, that we tied the British and we kicked their butts in New Orleans. And everybody wanted to move forward and do great things for the United States. So one of the people that helped negotiate it was Alexander I of of Russia. Again, it was signed at Ghent, Belgium in 1814. The main American representative there was John Quincy Adams. The British won the Great Lakes and part of Maine. The defeats at New York and Baltimore changed their minds. The British were concerned with withdrawing land taken from Napoleon. The Treaty of Ghent was signed again on Christmas Eve, 1814. It's an armistice. So both sides agreed to stop fighting and restore conquered land. So not 1 inch of territory ceded or lost. So while this is all happening, the Federalists are really upset, right, in New England. And they're really upset because they are pro-British and they do not want a war with England. As a matter of fact, many of the Federalists were actually still smuggling, still trading with the British during the War of 1812. So many New Englanders were still trading with them because they relied on them for trade. Again, manufactured goods, right? So they were relying on trade. So one of the things that happened during this time is that New Englanders, they decided to hold a meeting in 1814 at Hartford, Connecticut. They called it, of course, the Hartford Convention. Representatives from Massachusetts were there, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So what they wanted, they drew up a list of grievances that they wanted to share with Congress. They were going to go to Congress and they were going to present this list of grievances. They wanted money from Washington, D.C., because they felt like they had lost money all the way back to Jefferson's embargo. They demanded 2/3 vote in Congress for future embargoes. They wanted 2/3 of Congress to admit to the admission of new states, and they wanted 2/3 of Congress to be in line when it came to declaring war. And so again, they drew up this list of demands. So fear New England falling to the west and the south, right? So again, they were worried about that happening. They also demanded the abolition of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Because again, that gave some power to the southern states. They wanted to limit the president to single terms in office. They wanted to prohibit the election of 2 successive presidents from the same state, right? To avoid things like the Virginia dynasty, like what had happened with some of the current presidents. So an envoy was overwhelmed by news of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent. So when the Hartford resolutions were presented to Congress, right? So imagine this. Congress is partying, right? Treaty of Ghent is signed. The war is over. They find out about the Battle of New Orleans, right? Everybody's excited. Everybody's feeling very American, very nationalistic. And then these Federalists arrived, okay? And they said, wait a minute, why is everybody partying? We have this to present to you guys. And so they present these resolutions. And they essentially are seen as party poopers, right? like grumpy party poopers. And so the Federalists are black-eyed because of this convention, because it's seen as being sort of anti-American during the War of 1812, and the fact that they, after everybody's super excited, they want to present these resolutions. So the Hartford Convention, relatively, if you can think about it, the Hartford Convention, it's going to cause the eventual death of the Federalist Party. So again, they were seen as party poopers during what is now becoming known as the era of good feelings, right? Everybody is feeling good. So Americans had gained world's respect as a result of the War of 1812. Admirals Perry and McDonough displayed American naval power, which is actually going to play a big role in the continued development of the American Navy. The one real casualty of the War of 1812 was the Federalist Party. We see war heroes emerge, right? Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison. And many Indians were forced to give up land north of the Ohio River, right? Again, the Mississippi Confederacy. So one of the things that happens immediately after is, in terms of the nationalism and things that are happening, is that the Americans and the British eventually, it's interesting, like we have this war, but after the War of 1812, for the most part, we begin sort of developing a relationship with the British. So much so that in 1817, we actually signed a treaty called the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which what it basically did was it said that they would agree not to fortify the Great Lakes anymore. Today, Canada and the United States share the longest unfortified border in the world. It's 5,527 miles. And this is all again, a result of the Rush-Bagot Treaty. Napoleon is defeated. And so as a result of Napoleon's defeat, the Americans begin to sort of move west, right? And we kind of begin to see the defeat or the beginnings of Manifest Destiny. One of the most impressive results of the War of 1812 was American nationalism. For the first time, we begin to see American writers writing about American things. Some of the first popular American writers were Washington Irving and James Cooper. We begin to see textbooks begin to actually talk about American history, not just European history. We begin to see American magazines. One of the first ones was the North American Review. Nationalism, right? So the Bank of the United States was supposed to be rechartered, and it actually is rechartered with flying colors because everybody is super excited. Everybody's feeling really good. They also begin rebuilding the Capitol, right? So they're excited. Instead of looking at it as a glass half empty, right? Our Capitol is destroyed. They look at it as half full, and they think we have an opportunity to recreate the Capitol. Then one of the things that we also began to do is because the British decided that they were going to start dumping their goods for really cheap. They wanted to make money, right? Because of all the embargoes and everything else. British manufacturers had a surplus of goods. And so as a result of the surplus, they wanted to sell it to the Americans, and they wanted to sell it for cheap. But that would not be good for American manufacturers. And so the American government in 1816, they passed the first tariff that was passed for protective reasons. This is the tariff of 1816. And then Henry Clay of Kentucky has a plan to unify the country economically. Henry Clay, he presents to Congress what he calls the American system. He says the American system is going to be three-pronged. It's going to have a strong bank, okay, because it helps create credit. And this is a Democratic Republican talking, right? This is a Federalist creation, but he says it's working. Protective tariffs, right? So again, continue to have these tariffs to protect manufacturing. And of course, when the tariff is actually paid, that money goes into the bank. But that the revenue from the tariffs would actually be used to build interstate canals and interstate roads to connect the country through canals and roads economically. So this is what Henry Clay looks like. And then this is what the series of roads and stuff look like prior to what he wants to do. So these are the American roads when Henry Clay is presenting this after the War of 1812. So the country would be knitted economically and politically. There was a national outcry for better transportation. When the American system reached James Madison's desk, he actually vetoed it. He said it was unconstitutional for the federal government to build interstate roads and canals because the building of interstate roads and canals within a state should be left up to the states. And so he didn't believe that the federal government had the power to essentially force states to actually build roads and canals connecting them, that it should be left up to the individual states to do that. And so as a result of the fact that the federal government's not going to spend money on these canals, New York will actually build the first major canal, right, which is actually the Erie Canal, which connects Lake Erie to the Hudson River. 1816, the President of the United States, the new one, is a guy by the name of James Monroe. He was actually nominated by the Democratic Republicans. He wins 183 electoral votes to 34. As a result of the nationalism, like the superficial nationalism, and really it's superficial because it's a lot easier for one party to be really excited when the other party is sucking really bad. And so realistically, we will go from two parties to one during this era of good feelings. And so because there's really one party rule, it's a lot easier. So the New England Federalists welcomed him, right? Again, nobody wanted to attach themselves to the Federalist Party. So in era of good feelings, right, there really was not that much good feelings. Sectionalism was beginning to grow. So up until this point, one of the things Congress had done, right, is we had a certain amount of slave states and a certain amount of free states. And so it kind of helped create a balance of power within Congress between the free states and the slave states. But ever since the Constitutional Convention, the issue of slavery had been what is called an elephant in the room. And so I'll explain to you guys what it is. You can always look it up too, right, before we get to class in terms of knowing what that means. But there was an elephant in the room. It's something that everybody knew was there, but everybody was trying to ignore, and that was slavery. But as the country grew more and more, and some of these territories wanted to become slave states, the issue is going to continue to raise its head. So then an economic panic happens in 1819. One of the things that I'm going to explain to you guys in class, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in class, is how we get economic ups and downs all the time. So we have economic ups and downs all the time. And so there will be a panic in 1819. It's going to cause deflation, depression, bankruptcies, a bunch of other stuff. And part of the reason why is because of over-speculation. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about over-speculation, and I'm going to compare it a little bit to what happened in 2008. So the Bank of the United States foreclosed on mortgages and farms out west. The Bank of the U.S. was an enemy to Western frontiersmen after that. So when Andrew Jackson eventually takes over, because he sees himself as a representative of the West, he's going to try to kill the bank. But not during this time, because again, there's this wave of nationalism. So 9 additional states were added between 1791 and 1819. Like I said, most of the states were admitted alternately as free or slave in order to preserve the balance in the Union. In 1819, sexual tensions between slave and free states over control of Western lands came up again. In 1819, Missouri wanted to be admitted as a slave state. And the problem was that it actually would have created an imbalance in Congress. Congress tried to pass the Talmadge Amendment. And basically what it would have said was that no more slaves to be brought to Missouri and emancipation of children being born. So they tried to add an amendment to Missouri being admitted into the Union as a slave state, and that did not make the Southerners very happy. The fact that the federal government was going to try to add this amendment into the admission of states, which would eventually kill slavery in Missouri. So, again, you can see here on this map, 1789, right? 8 slave states, 5 free states, but then that will change. Okay, by 1861, right, you see that the number, right, by 1850 it's 15 and 15, and then by 1858 it's 15 and 17, just to give you an idea. So the Talmadge Amendment was thwarted by the Southerners, who said that this was ridiculous, that they were trying to get rid of slavery in Missouri. So the slave states had 11 states in the Senate equal to the free. Missouri was the first state west of the Mississippi and first to be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. And so a question was raised about the Talmadge Amendment, that if the federal government could try to end slavery in Missouri, would they try to end slavery at the federal level? And so conflict arose in Congress. So Henry Clay stepped in and saved the day. He becomes known as the Great Compromiser. Why? Because he steps in and he has a solution. He says, look, we have this territory up north called Maine, and there's enough people there to become a state. And they're going to obviously be a free state. So why don't we bring in Missouri as a slave state, and we bring in Maine as a free state, and that will create a balance within, right? So 11 and 11. So again, all future slavery, one of the things it also says, though, is that all future slavery would be prohibited in the rest of Louisiana Purchase, so above the 34th line of parallel. So the compromise will last for 34 years until 1854 with what happens with the Kansas and Nebraska Act. So A couple of the things that happened. President Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams negotiated a treaty in 1818 with England. It is the sharing of Newfoundland fisheries and English Canadians. It also allowed for the sharing of Oregon Territory for a 10-year period in terms of fishing. One of the things that was also beginning to affect the country, and actually Spain first, is the fact that these revolutions had been taking place. Argentina, Venezuela, Chile, they had been taking all of these, right? And so since Spain had to send its troops, even some of the troops that it had stationed in Florida, into Latin America to deal with these revolutions, the United States decided to kind of be tricky. So what they did is they sent General Andrew Jackson into Florida, and he told the Spanish that they were simply coming in to punish some of the Seminole Indians for the Mississippi Wars. And so the Spanish allowed General Andrew Jackson to come in, and once he was in, he basically put his foot down and said, guess what? We're here, we're taking over Florida, so we can either have a war over Florida, or you can get some money from us. So the Florida Purchase Treaty of 1819, Spain gave up Florida in exchange for the U.S. wanting Texas. Which will eventually come and get anyway later on, right? But not from Spain, but from Mexico, because Mexico will gain its independence in 1821. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the cases right now because I want you guys to take a look at them and do the extra credit. But I will address the cases in class, and we can even kind of do some stuff with them. But again, I want you to kind of take a look at them yourself first, and see if you guys have any questions about the cases, right? So my recommendation is that this weekend you actually do the extra credit, because it will be very beneficial to you in terms of understanding the cases when we look at them on Monday and Tuesday. Thanks, guys.